Hi everyone, and welcome to this video where we look at another member of my classic computer collection. And today we're going to have a look at a model that was the last of a venerable line of computers that started with a very famous Apple II. It's the Apple IIGS. So let's check it out. The founding forebear of the Apple IIGS, the Apple II, was introduced into the market in April 1977. Here you can see it with its chief designer, Steve Wozniak, engineer extraordinaire and co-founder of what was then Apple Computers. Fast forward through to 1984, and despite the dominance of IBM and the clone companies in the business market, and the home computer wars at the other end of the spectrum, the Apple II line was still profitable for Apple Computers, having found a market in schools and at the high-end hobbyist and home market with its latest iteration, the Apple IIe. This success could be attributed to a combination of good marketing, an open platform, and strong third-party support, both in software and hardware. For all that, steady sales couldn't disguise the fact that the 6502 8-bit technology used in the Apple II models was aging. The IBM PC XT and AT clones were complete, or at least near, 16-bit computers, and computers based on the 1632-bit Motorola 68000 series, like, say, the Macintosh and the prototype of the Amiga, which was shown in the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in 1984, clearly had the edge in creative computing. The Macintosh was the glamour kid of Apple computers at the time, yet some engineers in Apple understood there were legions of loyal Apple II owners who would dearly love to upgrade with an Apple product, but didn't want to lose their investment in what they had already learned and acquired. There was also potential for new buyers to the Apple II line who might be attracted by a modern machine that already had a sea of software. Swayed at least in part by this argument, Apple management grudgingly allowed a new machine to be worked on in the summer of 1984. The development team, in fact, revived an older project, the Apple IIX, which, due to poor focus and initial CPU problems, had attempted and failed to produce an Apple II 16-bit successor in the winter of 1983-84. This time, however, the focus was clear. It would be on Apple II compatibility, but with better speed, sound, and graphics. Hence, the Apple IIGS. Woz himself had an input into this machine. The IIGS was introduced in September 1986. Was based on the 16-bit Western Design Center's 65C816 microprocessor, running at 2.8 MHz. The machine sported a crisp RGB screen and could be expanded up to 8 MB of RAM. Came with a Mac-like keyboard and mouse, and contained a number of interfaces which, in earlier machines, required separate cards. Furthermore, it could use the newer, smaller 3.5-inch drives with ease. Software included a graphical user interface which developers continued to work on, and by September 1988 had refined into a system called GSOS. This took full advantage of the color graphic modes and sound features available. Despite all this bling, you could still pop the top and install whatever Apple II card took your fancy. Also, it ran all the Apple II 2 Plus 2e software, even off 5.25-inch discs if you wanted. This flyer alludes to the fact that the machine looked forward, but did not abandon what had gone before. For Apple II aficionados, what was there not to love? So here's mine. First up, yes, it does have that cheesy hue, especially the screen and the keyboard, but hey, it actually makes it look two-toned, so you could look on it as a custom colour job. The machine is from a couple of sources. The screen, keyboard and 3.5-inch drive were given to me as a complete IIGS unit. Unfortunately, when I opened the main box, I saw this mainboard horror. Yes, someone had forgotten to take out the battery. My suspicions were first aroused when I noticed what seemed to be corrosive liquid dripping from the box. Anyway, I kept the other parts until I managed to pick up another case with the mainboard a few years later. Machine was once more complete. What's more, the case is a little less yellowed than the previous one. Here's a shot of it by itself. So what's around the back? The answer is lots of ports. Starting from the left to right, we have a headphone jack, two serial ports, one for a modem and the other for a printer. Next is a joystick port, followed by a floppy drive connector. Then we have the RGB video connector, and next to that a composite video output socket. Finally, on the top right is a mains plug and on-off switch. And you can see plenty of covers there for connectors on cards that might go inside the machine. Here's the view inside the case. My machine is a revision 3 ROM, which was the final revision. It's got 1 megabyte on board. First model only had 256K. The board's a compact design. You can see there those Apple II slots. Note the one on the top right though, standing alone. This was a special slot, or is a special slot, for attaching a memory card. So let's have a flyby. So here's the machine all set up, ready to go. I've got a couple of drives attached. There you can see the Apple IIGS mouse, a kind of wedge-shaped device. Fairly characteristic. Here are the floppy disk drives I've got attached. A 3.5-inch one, which was part of the original 2GS, and a 5.25-inch one that I pinched from my Apple IIe. It's a shot of the screen and the box itself. You can see the controls for the screen around the side there. It's a very sharp, very clear screen. Gives a great image. There's the keyboard, two-tone as you can see, and very Mac-like. Just a shot from the other side. I must admit it's a design that's grown on me. I didn't like it at first. I thought it looked very square and boxy, but it's got a very small footprint, and you do get used to the shape, and I like it now. You just see around the back there all the cables attached. So that's a little video overview. So let's put it through some of its paces. So as I mentioned in the introduction, it's a very compatible machine, backwardly compatible. So there's no problem whatsoever booting ProDOS from an Apple IIe, or 8-bit ProDOS as they call it now, with the 2GS, from a 5.25-inch floppy drive, and it'll boot up just like the Apple IIe does. And you can see it there, so it's booting up into its system utilities, just the same as an Apple IIe, except you've got a much clearer screen, and that really is a big plus. You're not looking at the Apple through a composite video, as you normally would be with an Apple IIe, unless you had an RGB card, and it's a really crisp image. Here we are in 80 columns. My apologies for the screen flicker. Again, that's a camera and I can't seem to get rid of it in this video, no matter what settings I use. So here we are at the basic prompt. We'll just type cat for catalogue and you can see the directory. So it's operating just as an Apple IIe would. You can type in any basic program you like, and providing it conforms with AppleSoft Basic, it should work. So very compatible. I'm not sure if there's the odd copy protected disk that doesn't work, but from the literature I've read, it's certainly got an extremely high degree of compatibility with older Apple IIs. So running 8-bit ProDOS is all very well, but let's have a look at it running an operating system that was designed for the 2GS. This is GSOS, and I'm loading it off a floppy drive, as would have been typical when you loaded this particular piece of software. It's the latest version, so this version of GSOS was developed in the early 90s, so it's a considerable refinement of what was there originally. You can see it takes a while to load off the floppy. It takes up almost all of the room on the single floppy disk, which is 880 kilobytes. You can hear the floppy chugging away there. And when it finally loads, you see an interface that's very, very Mac-like. It's a trash can. You can see the various disks. And those of you that are discerning will notice two hard disks there, even though I haven't got any attached.
The secret is the CFFA 3000, which I've got installed in this particular machine. This also shows you how easy it is to get the machine open. Dead simple. And here it is. What a lovely piece of modern hardware this is. With this card plugged into one of your Apple slots, you can essentially run a number of drives, including the software, from either a CF card, as you can see plugged in here, a 32 megabyte one that I got from an old camera, or, if you like, a USB drive. And you can see there I've got a thumb drive plugged in at the other end. You could use either or both, as I'm using in this case. I've got my hard drive and hard drive software on the 32 megabyte flash card, and I've got my floppy disk images on the thumb drive. It's wonderful. I've got quite a few screenshots of the setup of this particular card, plus it loading software, and it certainly loads GSOS much faster from this card than it does from the floppy disk. But I decided that this video really wasn't about this card, it was about the Apple IIGS, so I've configured it to give me 2 hard drives, but it doesn't try and boot the machine. The floppy disk drives do that, and that's how it would have been back in the day when the machine first came out. Okay, so let's have a quick tour of GSOS, and you can see there a little bit of information about the machine that we're running on. You can see that it takes up a lot of memory. I did read in the literature that it was pretty difficult to run this with anything less than 1 megabyte. Here's the control panel, and you can set up various parameters just like you can in, say, a Macintosh. You can also go into a DOS interface to do this as well. Let me just do that by pushing a combination of keys. It'll get you to a kind of DOS equivalent of the setup section. So you can see there are a number of things that we can change. One of the things we can change is the speed, and this is quite important for old games and the likes. Let me just show you an example. Now I've left the setting on fast, which is the native speed of the 2GS. I could have slowed it down to, I guess, 1 megahertz, or at least what they call the slow speed, which you'd probably want to do for a lot of the old Apple games. So here we've loaded an Apple Panic, and you can see that it's really steaming along at an incredible rate, so it makes these games quite difficult to play when they're going that fast, unless you're very good at them. And certainly Apple Panic is one that I usually get completely thrashed on. Notice though the clarity of the screen. Colours are vivid, and it's really, really crisp. It's a joy to use, actually. Right, so let's get back to GSOS. Just take you through a quick squiz of the menus. Very Mac-like. I'll just open up a little bit of software. I'll run it from my virtual hard disk here. It is much quicker. And it's a small bit of software called Teach, which essentially is an editor, a text editor. And I guess it's very similar to Teach Text, which you get on the Apple Macs. I don't know why they call it Teach. Seems a strange name to me for a text editor. Doesn't really say what it does, and surprised they didn't come up with something a little more innovative, or at least something that was a bit more indicative of what you actually did with this piece of software. So essentially you can just type some text in, basic word processing if you like. So I'll just do that, put a few lines in. And you can do the normal things with them, so you can change the font, change the italics. Part of the course for any editor in a graphical user interface, really. Now, one of the problems with GSOS is that there wasn't a lot of software that was written for it, but there was some, and I'll show you one of the games that was written specifically for the Apple IIGS and then was ported to other platforms. It's a fun game. I've been through some of the levels. We'll just have a look at the first level and perhaps a little bit of the second. This is called Zany Golf. So let me just boot up this particular piece of software. Uses a lot of the features of the 2GS, like the graphics and the sound. And it's not called Zany Golf for nothing. It has this, well, almost carousel-like music that you'd get at the circus or perhaps a fairground, which just adds to the fun of it, really. So we're loading our main screen now, and very soon you'll see what it looks like. Here's our first course that we've got to navigate. So there you can see it. We've got a ball that we've got to manipulate here, and the thing is to select the ball and then pull the mouse back. The further you pull it back, the more swing that you get on your club, if you like. When you release the mouse button, you essentially hit the ball and it goes hopefully where you want it to. So very much like miniature golf, so it dribbles out onto a green, and then you've got to position yourself, position your cursor, and give it just the right amount of push to get it into the hole. You can see what I mean about that music playing. Oops, just a little bit too much force on it that time, so let's try again. Just a little bit. And there we go. So we're through the first green. So like miniature golf, it gets harder and harder as you progress through the game. The greens become more difficult. And like miniature golf, you've got to bounce the ball off various bits and pieces. You've got to angle it just right. You've got to push it under things. It's really quite challenging and a lot of fun. So for this one, for example, it's more complex than that first green. So we've got to get it round a sort of a U shape here. So you've got to bounce it essentially off the walls. And of course, like miniature golf, you've got a par that you've got to try and adhere to. And if you do go over par, well, that's the end of the game. So here's a scorecard. I failed on that last one, so I need to do it again. I've got some manuals with the machine, and as you expect with all Apple manuals, they're really, really high quality. This is getting started with your Apple IIGS. So it's a nice little ring-bound booklet showing you how to set the machine up. One thing about the Apple IIGS is that it does assume that you've got a little bit of knowledge about the Apple II. So I think if you came into it cold and you hadn't used an Apple II before, you could use the machine, but you would be a bit perplexed when they talk about slots and other such things. That if you've come from that Apple II world, you'd know of that. That'd be well embedded in your psyche. You know exactly what those concepts mean. But if you came from the outside, you'd probably be just a little bit puzzled, or at least there'd be a lot that you'd need to learn. Here's the second manual. This is far more comprehensive. This is the user manual, and does have various chapters on aspects of the 2GS. So how to add it to a network, for example. Using your memory as a RAM disk. Again, beautifully presented, well written, good illustrations, colour photos. Very professional looking. That's one thing about Apple Computer Inc. They really put out very, very good manuals in the 1980s. Here's another manual. This is the Apple 3.5-inch drive owner's guide. Tells you all about how to use the drive and what it does. Interesting thing about this manual is that it's in several languages, so It's really only a few pages at the beginning that are in English that are useful, at least to someone like me. But it has a handy little flap there, so you can use that to bookmark the section of the manual that's in your language. And finally, I've got this. A lot of people have memory expansion cards in their 2GSs, but the nearest thing I've got to the card is this manual. And quite frankly, I've never felt the need to actually have one in there. All the software I have run on the machine seems to run it quite okay on the 1 megabyte that's there at the moment, so I'd probably only be buying one just to keep up with the Joneses, but who knows, I might get one later just to make it complete. So what are my final thoughts on the Apple IIGS? It's a machine that originally I didn't really want. I felt it wasn't really a classic. It was more a kind of dead-end model. In fact, I was in no hurry to get a full system. Now that I've got one though, I feel differently. If your spiritual home is in the Apple II world, you would love this machine. Now, I'm not an Apple II fanatic, but I do enjoy the clarity of the RGB screen, the nice feel of the keyboard and mouse, GSOS, and the backward compatibility with the earlier machines. It's a fitting cap on the Apple II line. Commercially, the 2GS didn't do that well. That was largely due to Apple's neglect of the machine. It was hardly ever publicised or promoted, and consequently not much software was written to take advantage of its features, and it was canned at the end of 1992, ironically even before the final Apple IIe was taken out of production. In some ways, I can understand why Apple didn't run with this machine. Their focus was on the Macintosh, and it was probably a sensible commercial decision not to try and push two separate product lines, which may well have ended up competing with one another. So putting sentimentality aside, from a hard-nosed business perspective, ignoring the 2GS may have been the right thing for Apple to do. Nevertheless, I'm glad the model was made and that I've got one to enjoy.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that look at the Apple IIGS. There's more to come, so in the meantime, keep well, and we'll see you in the next video.